I thought it was just an awkward moment, one that would pass without leaving a trace. But I couldn't have been more wrong. That day marked the start of what would become the most complicated, forbidden chapter of my life. Even now, as I recount this story, my hands tremble. This isn't just a confession. It's me confronting the tangled mess of my guilt, shame, and longing. Logan, my mom's husband, was the kind of man who didn't need to raise his voice to command attention. Mature, confident, and effortlessly charismatic, his presence seemed to fill every room, even when he barely spoke. My mom, Diane, had married him after her first marriage fell apart. Logan and I had always kept things polite but distant. We weren't close and I was fine with that. But everything changed that evening. My mom was out, as she often was, catching up with her friends. That left the house to Logan and me. It was supposed to be an uneventful night, or so I thought. I was in my bedroom, standing in front of my mirror, wearing just my underwear as I reached for a dress to slip on. That's when I heard the soft creak of my door opening behind me. "Your door's open, Rachel," Logan said quietly from the doorway. His voice was calm, but it still sent a jolt through me. I turned, and there he was, his eyes fixed on me. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. I didn't cover myself, but I also couldn't move. He stood there, his hand resting on the doorframe, as though he was debating whether to step in or retreat. His gaze lingered for just a heartbeat too long, and a strange, unexplainable tension filled the air. My heart thudded in my chest, and I didn't know what to think. "I'm sorry," he said finally, his voice low. But there was something in his tone, an edge of hesitation, like he wasn't entirely sure he meant it. He stepped back, pulling the door closed behind him, but his presence lingered like a shadow. "It's fine," I muttered, my voice barely above a whisper. But deep down I knew it wasn't fine. Something had shifted in that moment, something I couldn't ignore. Even after he left, the image of his lingering gaze and the subtle tension in his voice stayed with me, replaying in my mind like a broken record. I told myself it was nothing more than an awkward moment, something I'd laugh off later. But I was wrong. Just a few days later it happened again. And this time it went further. "You're an amazing dance partner." I managed a small nod, my heart still pounding in my chest. "Thank you," I murmured, my voice barely above a whisper. Then, before my face could betray my emotions, I quickly made my way back to the table and sat down. Logan lingered for a moment, his eyes following me, before he eventually turned and found another seat. But in that fleeting moment his gaze said everything. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Whatever was happening between us, it had only just begun. When my mom, Diane, returned to the table, she was all smiles and excitement. "You two looked fantastic out there," she exclaimed, clapping her hands together as though she were the proud orchestrator of the whole thing. Her cheerful praise made my cheeks flush, but I forced myself to play it off. "It was fun," I replied, keeping my tone light. Logan simply nodded, his expression calm and polite. There was, however, a subtle curve to his lips, a quiet acknowledgement of her enthusiasm that made my chest tighten. Completely oblivious to the tension, Diane leaned closer, her voice buzzing with excitement. "Guess what? After the wedding, the girls and I are heading out for a little bachelorette after-party. Just us. Logan, you don't mind taking Rachel home, do you?" She flashed him a grin, as though her request were nothing out of the ordinary. Logan's smile was faint but genuine. "Of course, no problem," he replied, his tone as steady as ever. It was in that moment I saw it clearly, the unfairness of Diane's behavior. She was so caught up in her own plans, so eager to chase her fun, that she didn't even pause to consider how she was leaving Logan behind. On a night that was supposed to be about celebration, she was ditching him without a second thought. I swallowed down the unease rising in my chest. Diane didn't seem to notice or care about the awkward position she had put him in. Her focus was entirely on herself and the fun she planned to have with her friends. When the wedding finally wound down, Diane had already disappeared into the night with her entourage. Logan and I headed to the car alone. He started the engine with a quiet sigh, the sound almost lost in the stillness. The silence between us felt heavy, like a third passenger in the car. I stared out the window, unsure of what to say, or if I should say anything at all. Sometimes silence feels safer than words, and this was one of those times. But after a few moments, Logan broke the stillness, his voice calm but tinged with something deeper. Diane, she has her own priorities sometimes, he said, his gaze fixed firmly on the road. But nights like this, I don't know. You'd think your partner would want to be by your side, wouldn't you? His tone was steady, but beneath it, I could hear a quiet disappointment, a vulnerability I hadn't expected from him. I hesitated, caught off guard by the honesty in his words. Yeah, I said softly, my voice faltering. I think being there for each other matters more than people realize. Logan nodded slightly, his focus unwavering on the road ahead. You're right, he said, almost to himself. But I guess every relationship is different. For a moment, the space between us felt smaller, as though his vulnerability had bridged an unseen gap. In that shared silence, I felt the weight of his loneliness as though it were my own. It was an unspoken connection, fragile yet powerful, that neither of us fully understood. When we arrived home, Logan was the first to step out of the car. He opened the door for me with a swift, almost practiced motion and gestured silently for me to head inside. Good night, he said, his voice calm, though there was a hesitation in the way he spoke, as if he wasn't entirely ready to part ways. I walked toward my room, but something made me pause. I turned back, catching sight of Logan still lingering near the doorway. Logan, I said softly, my voice barely audible. Would you like to come in? Maybe we could talk for a while. His eyes softened at my invitation, and for a moment I thought he might say yes. But then he shook his head, his reluctance clear in the careful tension of his posture. Not tonight, he said quietly. I nodded, forcing a small smile as I stepped into my room. The door clicked shut behind me, the sound loud in the quiet house. Sitting on the edge of my bed, I couldn't stop my mind from racing. Diane's dismissive behavior at the wedding replayed over and over in my thoughts, intertwined with Logan's quiet disappointment and the memory of his lingering gaze. Why couldn't I stop thinking about him? Why did that moment in my bedroom when he had walked in by mistake feel so significant now? The house grew quieter as the hours dragged on. Diane still hadn't come home, and I couldn't help but wonder what Logan was doing at that moment, or if he was thinking about me too. My thoughts were a tangled mess, emotions warring with reason as I tried to make sense of it all. The confusion churned in my chest like a storm, until the faint creak of my door snapped me out of it. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. Slowly I lifted my eyes, and there he was, Logan, standing in the doorway, his hand resting on the knob as if he wasn't entirely sure whether to stay or go. His face was a mixture of determination and hesitation, his eyes searching mine for something unspoken. I stood abruptly, my pulse quickening as 1,000 questions filled my mind. Logan, I managed, my voice unsteady, betraying my shock. What are you doing here? He closed the door quietly, the click of the latch cutting through the heavy silence. He didn't move further into the room, instead lingering near the door like it was a line he wasn't sure he could cross. Rachel. His voice was low, steady, but the emotions behind it were anything but. I've been thinking about what you said, about Diane, about everything. And you're right. She's been unfair to me in ways I've tried to ignore for far too long. He paused, his gaze dropping to the floor for a moment before meeting mine again. But right now none of that matters, he continued, his voice softening. Right now all I can think about is you. My heart skipped, his words hitting me like a wave. I wanted to interrupt, to say something, but I couldn't. I just stood there, rooted in place, waiting for him to continue. The truth is, Logan took a deep breath, his shoulders tense. Ever since that day, when I accidentally walked into your room, I haven't been able to stop thinking about you. I've tried to ignore it, tried to push it aside, but it's there. You're there. And I can't make it go away. The weight of his confession pressed against the air between us, thick and heavy. My chest tightened as I tried to process what he was saying, my mind spinning as his words hung there, raw and unfiltered. Maybe this is a mistake, Logan murmured, his tone quieter now, tinged with uncertainty. Maybe I'll regret this tomorrow. But I couldn't hold it in anymore. Rachel, you're all I think about. Not just in passing, not some fleeting thought, I mean all the time. You're in my head constantly, and I don't know what to do about it. My hands trembled slightly as I struggled to respond, but the words just wouldn't come. Logan stepped forward just a small step, his voice lowering as though he were sharing a secret. You understand me in a way no one else ever has, he said, his gaze locking onto mine. Maybe you don't realize it, but you see me, Rachel. Really see me. And that's something Diane's never done. Not once. But you. He trailed off, his voice faltering. The vulnerability in his expression was almost too much to bear. My chest ached with the weight of his words, the raw honesty cutting through the confusion I'd been drowning in all night. I opened my mouth to say something, anything, but my voice caught in my throat. The silence between us felt endless, filled with the weight of all the emotions neither of us dared to voice aloud. Logan finally looked down, breaking the tension, and let out a long, weary sigh. I'm sorry, he whispered, his voice barely audible. I shouldn't have come here. I shouldn't have said any of this. He turned, his movements slow and deliberate, and headed for the door. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if he were carrying the weight of his own guilt. His hand hovered over the doorknob, and for a moment, I thought he was going to leave without looking back. But something inside me shifted, something I couldn't explain, couldn't fight anymore. Logan, I called out, his name escaping my lips in a whisper, but it carried more weight than I ever intended. He froze, his hand still on the knob, and slowly turned back to face me. His eyes, filled with longing and regret, locked onto mine, and the room seemed to hold its breath. Before I could second-guess myself, I let my hands reach for the straps of my dress. Slowly, deliberately, I slid them off my shoulders, the fabric cascading to the floor in a whisper of silk. The dim glow of the bedside lamp flickered softly, casting gentle shadows across my bare skin. The room felt impossibly still. The air between us was electric, charged with everything unsaid. Logan's gaze never left mine, his eyes dark with emotion, as if he were searching for answers I wasn't sure I could give. I didn't look away. I couldn't. It was as if this moment demanded my full attention, my full vulnerability. And in that silence, in that shared tension, everything else fell away. Logan's breaths grew uneven, his chest rising and falling as he stared at me with a mix of desire and hesitation. I could see the struggle in his expression, the battle between what he wanted and what he believed was right. The world outside ceased to exist, the only thing that mattered was the space between us, and what we would do with it. I haven't forgotten either, Logan, I said, my voice trembling, though determination began to rise within me, slowly drowning out the fear. Despite the shake in my words, the emotion was undeniable, raw and real. That day, the moment you walked into my room, everything shifted. It was like the ground beneath my feet wasn't steady anymore. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. And since that moment, I've been fighting so hard to push these feelings down. But no matter what I do, I can't. I like you too, Logan. Maybe I've liked you for far longer than I've ever been willing to admit. As the words spilled out, my chest tightened, my heart hammering so loudly I wondered if he could hear it. Each confession felt like a release, but at the same time it left me vulnerable, stripped bare emotionally in a way I'd never been before. Logan didn't say anything right away. His eyes locked on mine, studying me with an intensity that made my stomach flutter. There was something unspoken in his gaze, a magnetic pull, an understanding we both had been too afraid to acknowledge until now. Finally, I mustered the courage to say more. Tonight. I paused, inhaling deeply as I tried to gather the strength to put my feelings into words. Tonight, I don't want to fight it anymore. I don't care if it's right or wrong or if we're crossing a line we shouldn't. All I know is this. My voice dropped to a whisper as I held his gaze. This is how I feel. Logan took a small step toward me, his movements deliberate, cautious, as though he were waiting for my permission to close the space between us. When he reached out, his hand trembled slightly, but his touch was gentle as his fingers brushed against my face. The warmth of his hand sent a shiver down my spine, and before I could stop myself, I leaned into it. My breath caught in my throat as the tension between us grew almost unbearable. When our eyes met again, it felt like everything else had fallen away. The barriers, the excuses, the reasons we tried to hold back, it was all gone, leaving nothing but this moment. Slowly, Logan leaned in closer. His lips hovered just above mine, hesitating as if to ask permission. Then, softly, tentatively, he kissed me. It was gentle at first, almost like a question, as though he wasn't entirely sure if I'd pull away. But I didn't. That kiss, the sweet, careful brush of his lips against mine, was a spark that ignited something I hadn't even realized I'd been holding back. It was like a floodgate opening, and all the emotions, all the longing I'd buried deep inside, came rushing out. Logan's kisses grew deeper, more urgent, as if he couldn't hold back any longer. His hands moved to cradle my face, and I felt his intensity in every touch, every moment. I gave in completely, letting the connection between us take over. Step by step, I began backing up, barely aware of the cool edge of the bed pressing against the back of my legs. I let myself sink down onto it, my breath unsteady, my heart pounding. Logan's eyes never left mine as he followed, his movements unhurried yet purposeful. I watched as he reached for the buttons of his shirt, his fingers moving with a quiet precision that felt deliberate, almost reverent. One by one, he undid each button, the fabric parting to reveal the toned, broad chest I'd only dared to glance at before. When his shirt finally slid off his shoulders, he folded it neatly, placing it at the edge of the bed as though even in this moment, he didn't want to lose control entirely. Then he looked back at me, his gaze intense and unwavering, filled with something I couldn't quite name. Desire perhaps, but also something deeper. He leaned in again, closing the last of the space between us. His body was warm, solid, and I felt enveloped by him, by his presence. The air around us was thick, charged with unspoken feelings we'd both kept buried for too long. As his lips found mine again, the kiss deepened, and it wasn't just physical. It felt like something more. Something that went beyond words or logic. I could feel the weight of his emotions in every touch, every movement. Logan's hand moved gently, tracing a path along my arm before finding my hand. He entwined his fingers with mine, holding them tightly as though grounding me to the moment, to him. When he paused, pulling back slightly, his breath was warm against my skin. His gaze locked onto mine, and in his eyes, I saw an emotion so raw it nearly took my breath away. Tenderness. Vulnerability. "Ah, Rachel." His voice was soft, his tone filled with an unspoken promise. I didn't respond, not with words at least. Instead, I reached up, my fingers brushing against his cheek, silently telling him everything I couldn't put into words. In that moment, nothing else mattered. Not the questions, the doubts, or the consequences. All that mattered was this, "You're special, Rachel," Logan said quietly, his voice thick with emotion, each word deliberate and full of meaning. "I've always known that. But now, I understand it more clearly than ever." A soft smile spread across my face, and my chest swelled with warmth at the sincerity in his voice. "So are you," I replied, my tone gentle but filled with heartfelt conviction. The moment felt surreal, almost dreamlike, as though we had stepped into a world apart from everything else. A space where only we existed. When Logan lay down beside me, I rested my head on his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. It was calming, grounding me amidst the whirlwind of emotions swirling inside me. His chest was firm and warm beneath my cheek, his heartbeat a soothing metronome in the quiet. My fingers drifted across his skin, tracing absent patterns while I tried to summon the courage to speak. There was so much I needed to say, so much I needed to ask, but the words felt heavy, caught somewhere between my mind and my mouth. Finally, I broke the silence, my voice soft but laced with meaning. "You didn't come into my room by accident this time, Logan," I said, tilting my head to meet his gaze. My eyes locked onto his, forcing him to confront the truth even as it stirred a storm inside me. Logan's lips curved into a faint, almost bittersweet smile. But his eyes, those deep, searching eyes, betrayed the weight of his thoughts. He exhaled slowly, the moment stretching out between us. "No, Rachel," he admitted, his voice steady but low. "Nothing about this was accidental." He paused, his hand finding mine, his thumb brushing softly against my knuckles. "But I needed to tell you how I feel." I couldn't keep it in anymore. Not after everything. No matter how complicated it might be. I dropped my gaze back to his chest, my fingers stilling for a moment as I absorbed his words. Taking a deep breath, I let out the question that had been burning inside me. "You're such a special, incredible man, Logan," I murmured, my voice barely audible. "But what happens after this? How do we move forward? What does this mean for us?" Logan's expression softened, and he tilted his head, pulling me closer. His fingers threaded gently through my hair, brushing it away from my face as he held my gaze. His voice, calm but weighted with emotion, made my chest tighten. "There's a lot to think about," he began, his words trailing off for a moment as if he were searching for answers he didn't yet have. "Your family, my family, everything." "But Rachel," he hesitated, his eyes filled with longing and uncertainty, yet there was something steady about his tone. "I don't know what comes next," he admitted. "I don't have all the answers. But what I do know is that this right here feels real. You feel real. And being close to you, I can't deny it. I don't want to." His honesty hit me like a wave, stirring a mix of emotions I could barely contain. A storm raged within me, fear, excitement, hope, but at the same time his words anchored me. They made me feel safe, even as the uncertainty of what lay ahead loomed over us. I closed my eyes and let myself focus on the moment, on the warmth of his presence and the steady rhythm of his heartbeat beneath me. Whatever the future held, whatever challenges lay ahead, all we had was now. And in that moment that was enough. As the quiet enveloped us, I felt an unspoken promise settle between us. A fragile, tentative hope that somehow we'd figure it all out. If you've made it this far, thank you. Sharing this part of my life with you means more than I can put into words. But there's still so much more to tell. This is only the beginning of our story. Be sure to hit the follow button, turn on notifications, and leave a comment with your thoughts. I'm excited to hear what you think, and I can't wait to share the next chapter with you.